In this module, we're going to be talking about classification of living organisms. This relates to evolution because organisms are classified, at least in part, based on evolutionary relationships. To classify means to group in some way. There is a prompt in your margin to write that definition, so please pause here and go ahead and do that. When scientists first began to classify living organisms, they generally grouped everything as either a plant or an animal. Aristotle was one of the first people to do this. He was credited with the first classification system. He was the one that grouped living things into plant and animal. You may have heard that whole is it an animal, vegetable, or mineral idea. Animal being, of course, an animal, vegetable being a plant, mineral being something that is non-living. Later, of course, we developed new systems of classifications that further grouped them into categories beyond the simple plant and animal. A scientist by the name of Linnaeus further classified plants and animals by dividing them into related groups. He was important because he used the Latin language. Even though Latin was not being spoken conversationally, Latin is an unchanging language. So organisms that are named using Latin would have those names forever. So he first began by grouping organisms that were closely related into a category that he called a genus. For example, all canine or dog-like organisms were grouped into the genus Canis. So this would include things like domestic dogs that you would keep as a pet, wolves, coyotes, or foxes. All would be grouped into the same genus, Canis. He then gave every different type of organism in that group a specific name, which he called species. So for example, the domestic dog became Canis, that would be the genus name, familiaris, that would be the species name. The wolf, on the other hand, would be Canis, the same genus as the dog, but lupus as the species. Notice how those two scientific names are written. The genus name is always capitalized, but the species name begins with a lowercase letter. Both of these words are always either italicized or underlined, so it makes scientific names easy to identify. This system of giving every organism a two-word name consisting of genus and species is called binomial nomenclature, which literally translates to two-name naming. This practice continues today. Every living organism has its own scientific or Latin name. So for example, here is a brown recluse spider. Its scientific name is Loxosceles, that's the genus, reclusa, that's the species. This organism, shown here, is an organism that you probably call a roly-poly. Other people have different names for it, like pillbugs or sowbugs. They are, in actuality, a type of isopod. So as you can see, there are lots of different names that could be used to identify this one organism. Using the practice of binomial nomenclature eliminates that confusion. It doesn't use a common name, which might be different for different places, like in different countries, for example. It allows scientists around the world to more easily communicate, making sure that they're talking about the same organism. So for a long time, even after the microbial or microscopic world of bacteria and things was discovered, there was still the system of using only two kingdoms, plants and animals. Science can be very slow to change. In 1969, which may seem like a long time ago to you, but actually wasn't that long ago at all, the knowledge of the diversity of organisms increased so much that a scientist by the name of Whittaker expanded classification of organisms to include 5 kingdoms of life. The kingdoms that he used were plant and animal, but then he subdivided those kingdoms to include fungi, protista, and monera. This science of classifying organisms is called taxonomy. So we now actually classify organisms based on 7 levels of organization, or 7 taxa. These taxa can be remembered through a very simple mnemonic device or memory aid. The taxa in order are kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. The memory aid you can use to remember that is King Philip came over for green soup. There's a place in your margin to write that in, so please pause here and do that. Looking at this example of the classification scheme of a human and a dog, there are some really important things that I need you to notice. The first is that both of these organisms are in the same kingdom, kingdom Animalia. They are also in the same phylum. They both have a backbone, which is the characteristic that keeps them in the same phylum, phylum Chordata. Furthermore, both the human and the dog nurse their young with milk. This places them into the class Mammalia. Not all animals with backbones, like chordates, are mammals, but humans and dogs both are. Look at the level of order, however. At the level of order, the human and the dog diverge. Humans are classified as primates because we walk upright and we have opposable thumbs. Dogs, on the other hand, are classified in the order Carnivora because they are basically meat eaters. From that point on, the classification scheme is different. So we have 3 taxa in common with the dog. The more taxa 2 organisms have in common, the more closely related they are. Don't forget your memory aid to remember the levels of classification, or the taxa. King Philip came over for green soup. In this classification scheme, the kingdom is the most general of the 7 taxa. So that means most organisms will be found in the kingdom level. This will be the largest level containing the most number of organisms. Species is the most specific. Down at that level, there will only be 1 organism left. A species is defined as a group of organisms which can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So all domestic dogs are the same species. You can interbreed domestic dogs. For example, you can cross a Labrador Retriever and a Poodle, and you will get what we now call a Labradoodle. All domestic dogs are the same species. On the other hand, although domestic dogs and foxes are similar in classification, they are not in the same species. You cannot interbreed them and produce fertile offspring. Today, the classification system that we use includes 3 domains of organisms, which is divided into 6 kingdoms, expanded from the 5-kingdom system that Whitaker first used. These domains are based on new information about possible evolutionary relationships. Go ahead and stop here. Look in the margin on page 146 and fill out the blanks in the History of Classification prompt. Coming back, you can see the 3 domains include the prokarya or bacteria. There is only one kingdom there, the eubacteria kingdom. For an example, E. coli is a bacteria you may have heard of. The archaea domain also only includes bacteria, but these are the more ancient types of bacteria. For example, those that lived in hot springs, the thermophiles. From there, we have the eukarya domain. The eukarya domain includes all organisms that have eukaryotic cells, so everything other than bacteria, protista, plants, fungi, and animals are all in the domain eukarya. You can see by this diagram how this was determined based on a family tree of sorts, based on evolutionary relationships, which is why we are learning about classification at this time after we have just finished discussing evolution. I need you to pause the presentation at this time, look at the diagram that is shown here, and answer the 8 questions on your own sheet of notebook paper. When you are finished, come back to the presentation. Today, most organisms we think have been identified and named by scientists. Of course, there are locations that are largely unexplored, like the deep ocean and certain areas of tropical rainforests. So there may be new organisms out there that have not yet been identified. But if they have been identified and if they have been named by scientists, you can use a tool called a dichotomous key to identify the name of that organism. Once again, a dichotomous key is something that a scientist uses to find out the name of an organism that has already been classified and has already been named. A very simple dichotomous key is shown to you here. This dichotomous key, as with all of them, starts at statement number 1. No matter which organism you are trying to identify, organism 1, 2, 3, or 4, or 5, you always start at the paired statement number 1A and 1B. You ask yourself that question: is the organism a plant or is the organism an animal? So looking at organism number 1, it's clearly a plant. That then tells you what path to take. If the organism is a plant, the path you take is 1A, which tells you then to go to statement 2. You follow your choice. Statement 2 says the leaves are on a branch or the leaves grow from the ground. Looking at organism 1, you can see that the leaves grow from the ground, and that ultimately gives you the name of the organism, a cattail in this case. You should practice using this very simple dichotomous key. As soon as you feel comfortable using the dichotomous key to organisms, you need to pause the presentation and complete page 4A in your biology handbook. After completing page 4A, you may come back to the presentation. If, on the other hand, you find an organism that has not yet been classified or named, for example, an organism that has been newly discovered in a tropical rainforest, a taxonomist, or a scientist who classifies organisms, begins the process. There are lots of different modern tools that are available for scientists to use to try to decide where to place this organism in a classification scheme. The first tool is looking at the physical characteristics of the organism. This is called its morphology. This, most of the time, gives the scientist enough information to decide which domain and kingdom that organism will be placed into. For example, if you find an organism resembling an ant, there are lots of different species of ants, you can reasonably say that this would be an organism in the domain Eukarya and in the kingdom Animalia. Similarly, if you find an organism that has a eukaryotic cell that is made of eukaryotic cells at all, you automatically know that it will be in the domain Eukarya. One of the most important tools scientists now have available to them are DNA and biochemical analysis tools. These tools allow scientists to test less visible but distinguishing characteristics. These are tools that would not have been available even 30 years ago. This allows us to make a much better judgment about which domain, kingdom, phylum, etc., the organism should be placed into, based on similarities to other organisms. So, for example, a test called a Gram stain will allow scientists to determine whether or not bacteria cells should be grouped into the domain Archaea or Prokarya. Another important way scientists are able to group organisms is by comparing embryology. An embryo is a developing offspring of an organism. By looking at the embryological development, we can group organisms that have a similar fetal development closer to one another. So looking at this diagram, I want you to look at the first row only. Looking at the first row only, there are very few differences between those four organisms. If you move down to the second row, you can see that the first organism looks quite a bit different now from the other three. This gives us information that the other three are more closely related to each other than they are to the first one. Looking down now at the fourth row, you begin to see even more differences. The first one and the second one are more different than the third and fourth. This gives us information that the fish, which is the first one, is different from the turtle, which is the second one, but that the rabbit, the third one, and the human, the fourth one, are more similar to each other. Evolutionary phylogeny is one of the most important ways scientists classify new organisms. This describes evolutionary relationships between organisms, which are deduced based on shared traits, also called characters, that may have been passed from an ancestor to new species. These traits might include physical traits, like the presence of a jaw, or maybe genetic traits or shared genes. These relationships, based on shared traits or characters, can be illustrated in a phylogenetic tree, also called a cladogram. Please pause here and fill in the 4 things we can compare to classify new organisms. The prompt is on the bottom of page 148. Looking at this cladogram, we have the diagonal line at the base of which is the shared ancestor for all of these organisms. Same thing goes for the cladogram that's been added here, the one that's not in your book. At the base of the diagonal line would be an ancestral organism. In this cladogram that is in your book, if you look up at the animals, which is the last thing to have evolved, you will see that they are closest on the cladogram to the fungi. That would indicate that they have a closer relationship to fungi than to anything else shown. This makes sense because fungi and animals are both heterotrophic organisms, meaning that they have to take in food. If you look at the cladogram that is in your book, you will see that the first kingdom to show up coming off of the shared ancestor is the bacteria kingdom. And again, looking at the cladogram that's in your book, you can see that the plant kingdom branches off from the protist kingdom, meaning that the plants likely evolved from simpler protists. Hopefully you've been answering these questions on page 149. Look now at the additional cladogram. You can see that there would be a shared ancestor at the base. The hagfish would have been the first organism to evolve. The character that it would have diverged from the others as a result of was jaws. Anything below the jaws notation on the cladogram would not have that character. So the hagfish doesn't have jaws. But everything above that does share that character. So you can see up at the top, the characters that are shared by the mouse and the chimp are fur and mammary glands. Once again, this is called a cladogram, and it allows us to see evolutionary relationships based on shared traits or characters.